Welcome to lecture number 4. Today's topic will cover a wide range of different issues dealing with the history of the United States at or about 1900. There are a few themes to be addressed in this lecture. First, we'll investigate daily life for many people in the United States at the turn of the previous century. Life for African Americans, immigrants, and farmers are just a few of the groups to be discussed. Next, we'll look at domestic politics of the 1890s, eventually leading up to the presidential election of 1896. Finally, foreign policy will be addressed as we explore the Spanish-American War. We will begin the core of this lecture by investigating the economic situation faced by many African Americans during this era. A good place to begin is with some statistics addressing the black population of the United States. In 1900, almost 9 million African Americans lived in the nation. An overwhelming majority of those lived in the American South. Below is a hyperlink to some census data offering additional information on this subject. In the 1870s, as many as maybe 15,000 African American families became exodusters as they left the Deep South and moved to Kansas in order to establish homesteads of their own. The reason why there weren't more of these families is because it took a lot of resources in order to make this journey. So most black families lived in the South, and they faced the economic situation of being sharecroppers. This developed as a compromise of sorts between former slaves and landowners in the years after the Civil War. There were a variety of characteristics associated with sharecropping in the American South. Typically, landowners would subdivide their plantations into 50-acre plots. An individual family would be responsible for raising crops, usually cotton, on those 50-acre segments. Secondly, because sharecroppers had very little money, they usually would give 50% or half of their crop as rent in return for the use of the land. This map of the Barrow plantation from before and after the Civil War demonstrates the different land uses of a plantation. On the left, we see a large plantation including slave quarters from 1860. In 1881, we see the same plantation. However, it's subdivided into different plots for Sabrina Dalton and Lizzie Dalton in the upper right, and then we see Frank Maxey, Joe Bug, Jim Reed, Nancy Pope, and many others in those 50-acre plots on the right. In the Deep South, about 3/4 of the land was sharecropped. By the way, most black families were sharecroppers, but there were a significant number of white families who also sharecropped the land. This map provides a visual aid demonstrating the percentage of sharecropped farms by county in the American South by the late 1800s. In most communities, sharecropping was combined with another economic system called crop lien. This very often involved merchants advancing sharecroppers a variety of different supplies on credit. Sharecroppers would need seed, tools, maybe even livestock or furniture. How about some food in order to survive until their crops came in? The problem was that the interest rates were incredibly high because sharecroppers didn't have any collateral. They might pay as much as 50% in interest for the products that they received. The problem with this economy based on sharecropping and crop lien was that it very often created a cycle of indebtedness. Poor whites as well as blacks were very often unable to escape. As we see from this visual aid on the right, this is a store owner's record of debts by a variety of different sharecroppers. This table demonstrates literacy rates in the American South in the years after the Civil War. As you can see from this table, large numbers of black Americans as well as whites were illiterate in states like South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. This only added to the economic woes facing people who were sharecroppers. While there were more white sharecroppers than black, by 1900, 75% of all Southern blacks lived as sharecroppers. Thus far, the lectures focused on the economic situation facing many African Americans at the turn of the century. We'll now explore the system of segregation in the United States and its legal basis. The court case Plessy v. Ferguson was one of the most important and controversial rulings ever handed down by the Supreme Court. It involved a law in the state of Louisiana that required that all railroad cars be segregated on the basis of race. A man by the name of Homer Plessy sued, and he claimed that this wasn't equal treatment under the law. Eventually, the Supreme Court issued a ruling in 1896. By an 8-to-1 margin, the Supreme Court ruled that separate facilities for people of different races were legal, as long as they were equal in quality. This gave us the so-called separate but equal doctrine. That separate but equal ruling allowed local communities to pass their own segregation laws. These were called Jim Crow laws, and they established legalized segregation all over the United States, whether it be in the South, the North, the West, or the East. And just about everything was segregated: hospitals, theaters, courtrooms, schools, cemeteries, and many other items. On the right, we see an image from a little bit later in the 20th century, but what we see is a Coca-Cola dispenser, and they're encouraging people to purchase their product. However, white customers only. Black Americans also had to be concerned about violence, or at least the threat of violence, with organizations like the Ku Klux Klan or the White League, as shown in these images here. Violence against black Americans was a real concern, as these statistics from the late 1800s and early 1900s show. Below is a hyperlink to the Jim Crow Museum. I would encourage people who are interested in this subject to click on the hyperlink and find additional information. The next topic to be explored will be immigrant life in the United States in 1900. I think the best way to approach the issue of immigration is to first look at some statistics. Between 1840 and 1860, about 4 million immigrants entered the United States. Between 1860 and 1890, this had jumped to 10 million. Between 1890 and 1920, 18 million immigrants entered the United States. And one of the things that's interesting about this latter period is that these were so-called new immigrants, immigrants from eastern and southern regions of Europe. This figure demonstrates the so-called changing face of American immigration from 1865 to 1920. During the first 50 years or so of this, we see that immigration is dominated by so-called old immigrants, people coming from northern and western Europe. Later, in the orange areas, we see so-called new immigrants from Italy, Greece, maybe even parts of Russia or Eastern Europe. In some cases, new immigrants and old immigrants clashed. In order to process these increasing numbers of immigrants arriving in the United States, a new location was opened in 1892. This was called Ellis Island. It's a great place to visit if you have the opportunity, but if you don't, I've got a hyperlink below to the website. This map identifies the numbers of foreign-born whites versus native-born whites by county in the United States in 1910. Notice the yellow areas. Those are areas where fewer than 5% of the population was born outside of the United States. In the green and blue areas, those indicate that at least 50% of the people living in those counties were born outside of the United States. Look at states like Wisconsin, Minnesota, and maybe even North Dakota. Large numbers of immigrants moved into those areas. As large numbers of immigrants entered the United States, we also see tremendous urban growth in the years after the Civil War. I'd particularly like to point out the growth of Chicago from a little bit less than 300,000 to almost 1.7 million, and New York from just under 1.5 million to about 3.5 million by 1900. Living conditions in these growing cities were very far from ideal. On the left, we see how city dwellers very often lived in tenement houses, which were often overcrowded and unsanitary. On the right, we see an actual photograph of a tenement home. As this image demonstrates, families in these projects lived under very cramped conditions and even strung clotheslines between different buildings in order to complete their laundry. Now,